twice before.
No assistance needed. Okay.
Off you go while I'm...
Now the reason for the bang was only so that we can bring the film to some of the pictures we're putting out when we start to put them together. But anyway, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening, and particularly our ladies from Masonic Freemasonry. Welcome to you. The people, little heads looking around, who are the ladies? We're very honoured to actually have John with us this evening. He's travelled up from London to be with us, and obviously he's going to present this, the sort of his thoughts, the way that he put together the book he's finding. This is a really great book, and if anyone hasn't got it, I would really recommend it. And it's really great for people who are not Masons as well. I mean, there's an awful lot in there, which, you know, I've been in Masonry for 50 years, and there are things in here which I didn't realise, so I really would recommend it. Let me tell you a little bit about John. He is an author, a broadcaster, and also an academic, and his speciality is in Italian history. I know that he likes Italian food because he's written a book that was highly acclaimed and by the Annual Book Society in 2007. He has written some books on the mafia. There are a couple of books outside that have been brought up if anyone wants to buy them. They're £10 per book. He's written about the Costa Nostra, the history of the Sicilian Mafia, and he lived to tell the tale. And he also then was so bold, he went on and read and wrote The Bug Brothers of the Rise of the Italian Mafia. And it obviously went down really well because he was actually awarded by the president of Italy a knighthood, the equivalent of a knighthood. And I'm going to read out what it was that he got. So he was awarded the commander of the Order of the Star of the Italian Solidarity. And for a man born in Dundee and dragged up in Leicester, he's actually done quite well for himself. He's actually given this presentation at United Grand Lodge, and it's gone down very well. And I know that he's done a number of things around the country. And he said something on the way up here. Was it when you did the Indian one? Was that the one that was 1,000?
The Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian. Oh, no, I'm with you. Yes, the Indian network of the Indian diaspora Masonic group, based
so he presented this book in India, and he had over 1,000 on the Zoom meeting. So, you know, it's quite something. So, gentlemen and brethren, let's give him a warm welcome from Suffolk.
Thank you very much, everyone. I am a historian, and I'm not a Freemason. I'm a professional historian in that I'm Professor of Italian Studies at University College London, and I've written about Freemasonry because I find it fascinating, because I find it significant, but also because I spotted what I think is an opportunity, in the sense that, generalizing broadly as I sort of began to immerse myself in the subject, it seemed to me that there were really two basic ways of writing about Freemasonry. One was the way that Freemasons, including many very, very able Masonic historians, write about Freemasonry, the history of Freemasonry particularly, which is as a noble tradition of brotherhood and charity and so on and so forth. And secondly, there is the sort of journalistic way about Freemasonry, which actually corresponds in this country and some other countries, many other countries, to the sort of common sense out there among the public, which is that the Freemasons are a sort of grubby cabal who want to take over the police and the judiciary, if they haven't already. Now, so there's a sort of dialogue of the deaf about Freemasonry and its history, and I think there are plenty of reasons for that, but I don't think that's enough. I don't think that works, and I wanted to try and break down that dialogue of the deaf to write something that would be of interest to both Masons and non-Masons, that would be illuminating and fascinating. And when you need to talk to different audiences like that, audiences separated by a lot of preconceptions, I mean, my view was that there were, whilst both of those views of Freemasonry in different places and different times around the world and over 400 years of history have an element of truth to them, that there is a world of stories in between those two extremes that you can get to if you do the research, and above all, if you tell stories. That is the secret. I've now got quite a lot of experience of writing for a mainstream audience. My books have been translated in something like 20 languages. Telling stories is the secret of reaching an audience, bridging divides between groups of people. And in order to give you an idea of the kind of story and the storytelling approach that I adopt, I wanted to begin with a reading. And this is the very beginning of the book, so apologies for those of you who may have read it already, but it gives you a flavour of the approach. Very beginning of the book. On the 14th of March 1743, as he was leaving a Lisbon coffee house, John Custos, a 40-year-old jeweller from London, was grabbed, handcuffed and bundled into a chaise. A short time later, he found himself in one of the most feared buildings in Europe. Looming at the northern end of Rossio Square, the Estaus Palace housed the Portuguese headquarters of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Just like hundreds of witches, heretics and Jews who'd been brought there before him, Custos had his scalp shaved and was stripped naked save for his linen undergarments. Confined in a dungeon, he was subjected to a meticulous regime. Isolation and silence were rigidly enforced. A fellow prisoner with a persistent cough was cudgelled into unconsciousness. No communication with friends and relatives was permitted. No possessions, no books, not even a Bible. Nothing that would interrupt the voice of divine conscience. Nothing to block out the prisoner's all too vivid imagining of the horrors that awaited him in the Inquisition's auto da fe. This grand spectacle of religious justice was a procession culminating in prayers, incantations and public execution by one of two methods: the mercy of strangling for those who embraced the Catholic faith at the last minute, and for the obstinate, the unutterable torment of the flames. Custos tells us that the inquisitors initially questioned him in a spiritually nurturing tone. Nonetheless, he had the clear sense that his replies were futile. Eventually, he was summoned from his cell and brought before the president of the Holy Office, who read out the charges as if talking to a wall. That he has infringed the Pope's orders by his belonging to the sect of the Freemasons. This sect being a horrid compound of sacrilege, sodomy, and many other abominable crimes, of which the inviolable secrecy observed therein and the exclusion of women were but two manifest indications, a circumstance that gave the highest offence to the whole kingdom. And the said Custos, having refused to discover to the inquisitors the true tendency and design of the meetings of Freemasons, and persisting on the contrary in asserting that Freemasonry was good in itself, wherefore the proctor of the Inquisition requires that the said prisoner may be prosecuted with the utmost rigour, and for this purpose desires the court would exert its whole authority and even proceed to tortures. Custos was taken to a square windowless room in a tower. Quilted padding lined the door to deaden the sound of screaming from within. The only light came from 2 candles on the desk at which the tribunal secretary sat waiting to record his confession. A doctor and a surgeon looked back at him from the shadows. 4 burly men seized him and clamped him to a horizontal rack by closing an iron collar around his neck. They fitted rings with ropes attached to his feet and yanked his limbs to their fullest extent. Then 8 loops of cord, 2 over each arm and 2 over each leg, were passed through the frame and fed out into the torturer's hands. Custos felt the cords tighten and finally start to saw through flesh. Blood spattered the floor beneath him. If he died in this torment, he was told, only his own obstinacy would be to blame. Between his own cries, he heard the inquisitor pose the questions he'd already heard many times. What is Freemasonry? What are its constitutions? What goes on in the lodge meetings? Eventually, he fainted and was carried back to the dungeons. 6 weeks later, the inquisitor tried again with a different method, the dreaded strappado. Upright this time, Custos had his arms gradually stretched back behind him, palms facing outwards until the backs of his hands met. Then his arms were pulled slowly upwards until his shoulders were levered from their sockets and blood poured from his mouth. As he beseeched heaven for patience, the inquisitors persisted with their questions. Is Freemasonry a religion? Why do you not admit women? Is it because you are sodomites? When the doctors had reset his bones and he'd spent 2 months recovering, the torture resumed. This time a chain was wound round his torso and attached to his wrists. Pulleys drew the chain ever tighter, squeezing his insides and dislocating his wrists as well as his shoulders. Why all the secrecy in Freemasonry? What do you have to hide? Custos tells us that he spent 16 months in total in the dungeons of the Estaus Palace and endured 9 bouts of torture before the time finally came to be paraded through the streets in the auto da fe of 21st of June 1744. But he was lucky. While 8 of his fellow prisoners were burned alive at the climax of the procession, he was condemned to 4 years as a galley slave. The relative freedom this sentence afforded him gave him the chance to contact friends who mobilised the British government to obtain his release. When he reached London on the 15th of December 1744, he set to writing his story. But he'd barely begun when the Jacobite rebellion of 1745 broke out. Bonnie Prince Charlie Stuart raised his standard in the Highlands of Scotland, intent on enforcing his Catholic claim to the throne that had once been his grandfather's. The Jacobite army descended as far as Derby in the heart of England, sowing panic in the capital. Although it was eventually crushed, the rebellion revived the public appetite for books documenting the barbarities of the Roman Church. The Sufferings of John Custos for Freemasonry, complete with engravings of all the tortures its author had endured, was published at the perfect moment. Custos became a celebrity. The book was widely translated and remained in print well into the 19th century. Here was a martyr for Freemasonry and its inviolable secrecy. Except that things did not quite go in the way Custos said. Over 2 centuries later, the Inquisition's transcription of his interrogation